I remember being extremely excited for The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild before it launched back in 2017. An open-world Zelda game sounded like a dream come true, and I watched countless videos speculating about what the game could be like back when it was still slated to be a Wii U exclusive. I remember the day the game came out vividly. I was super antsy for the entire school day, painstakingly watching the hours tick by until I could finally go home and open my long-anticipated Nintendo Switch. Then when I finally got home, I ran inside to see that glorious Amazon package that held my prize. I ripped it open, set up the console, and finally was ready to play the game it felt like I had waited an eternity for. So naturally I played 1-2 Switch for 4 hours instead. Later that night though, I popped in Breath of the Wild, and I was instantly hooked. I was enamored with exploring the open world, scouring the land for materials and shrines, battling countless enemies, putting who knows how many resources into that town building side quest. I put in as many hours as I could in between my high school classes. I couldn't put the game down. I really enjoyed my time with Breath of the Wild, so when a sequel was announced just a year later, naturally I was pretty excited. There was a lot of stuff I thought could be improved on to make the game stand out even more from the original, so I was intrigued to see what kind of direction they could take the game in. Maybe they could delve into a deeper story, or make more intricate and unique dungeon designs. The sky was literally the limit, and I was excited to see what Nintendo would bring to the table. And then we had to wait 6 years. Obviously that wasn't entirely on the dev team. The global pandemic derailed the development of tons of games, not just Zelda, but I do think it inadvertently created a growing expectation that the game would be almost completely different from Breath of the Wild. They did come out and say that they would be using the same map as a base, but surely with that much of a wait they would have added something more substantial, right? As we saw more and more of the game shown off in trailers and got more information in interviews, things were looking pretty good. There seemed to be more of a focus on story this time around, and the sky exploration sounded promising. Eventually, the game came out in summer 2023, and I picked it up at launch, put in about 70 hours, and then dropped it. It's pretty rare for me to flat out drop a game before finishing it, so I've been trying to figure out why I don't really feel the need to finish this game, despite enjoying the time I did put into it. After reflecting on my time with both Tears of the Kingdom and the original game, I've come to the conclusion that I'm not completely sold on this new direction for Zelda. At least not yet. While I really enjoyed Breath of the Wild when it came out, playing Tears of the Kingdom, there was this air of ambivalence laced across my entire playthrough. The game started out pretty promising, getting a glimpse of both the Sky Islands and the game's more linear narrative, but over time these things became less and less impressive to me, and the same things I had done to death in Breath of the Wild kept popping up over and over again. The map being mostly the same didn't help in that regard, since I was quite literally exploring the same locations all over again, but I also think a lot of the newer aspects of this game are somewhat lacking. The sky exploration was personally a huge letdown. The tutorial island sets a pretty good precedent, but after that a lot of them are tiny, disconnected landmasses that all blended together after a while. They all have similar puzzles and challenges to the stuff you'd find in the overworld, so while traversing between them can be pretty interesting, the islands themselves left a lot to be desired for me. Another thing I was really disappointed with was the game's story. The game opens with this really cool set piece where Link and Zelda are exploring a cave under Hyrule Castle, discovering a bunch of ruins of an ancient civilization. Eventually they stumble across the decayed body of Ganondorf, before he awakens and corrupts Link's arm, destroys the Master Sword, and separates Link and Zelda. What I really like about this opening is that we get to see more of the characters' personalities, namely Zelda. She's freaking out over the tiniest discoveries in these ruins, it's really adorable. Despite Link still being silent, the two bounce off each other really well, and it made me really excited to see the two interact more. From here the story becomes more formulaic, as Link ventures off to investigate a bunch of regional phenomena that mysteriously popped up, and it was here that I realized I wasn't really a fan of how the rest of the narrative is presented. The original Breath of the Wild had most of its plot told as a series of memories that you could find by exploring specific areas of the map. These memories would correspond to the areas you find them in, and they highlight specific character moments leading up to the re-emergence of the Calamity. Tears of the Kingdom takes a similar approach, where you find a series of memories that showcase Zelda's time in the past and the rise of Ganondorf. While I think the structure works in Breath of the Wild, here I think it really hurts the way the story is presented. I like that the memories in the original game are tied to the locations you find them in while exploring the map. The environment is literally jogging Link's memory, and I think that context is really neat, but I also prefer how disconnected each of the memories are. A majority of them don't lead into one another and are focused on one character or moment in time, so finding them out of order doesn't hinder your interpretation of the scenes. I think this more self-contained nature works here because it's not trying to tell a linear, concrete story. They give you little snippets of character and world building while still leaving room for interpretation. Tears of the Kingdom, though, is trying to tell a more linear story, but with the same disconnected structure from the original game. Scenes are scattered around specific parts of the map, and because you can find some of the later scenes before the earlier ones, not only can things just not make as much sense as they should, but you also run the risk of ruining any tension in the earlier scenes if you, happen to find one of the later scenes before the earlier ones. Can you guess what happened in my playthrough? I ended up finding the scene where Ganondorf kills the queen as my second memory, which made me check out of the rest of the memories pretty early since I thought I knew where they were going. As it turns out though, I wasn't really spoiled on anything because the story doesn't go anywhere to begin with. Watching all the cutscenes in order after the fact, it's pretty clear that Ganon is evil from the start, but I went into the game thinking there was going to be a greater emphasis on story and by extension his character, so having the twist spoiled for me so early on kinda took me out of it. Even watching them all again now, I don't think the story is all that unique even without that expectation. It's a very typical, king with special magic is betrayed by his right-hand man that's very clearly evil. And because the story is so segmented, we don't really get to learn anything about the new characters they added. I couldn't tell you anything unique about Rauru or Sonia other than that they're nice. Looking back at the champions from the Breath of the Wild, they have clear character traits and motivations that, while not super deep or anything, are at least there, and they help endear you to each of the characters. And those guys are there for a fraction of the time as Rauru and Sonia. Then there's Ganondorf himself. The scene where Link and Zelda meet him implies that he has some kind of history with them. But then in these flashback scenes he's only around for a handful of them before he offs the queen and rises to power. The only reason he knows who Link is because Rauru mentions him literally the moment before he seals him away. Zelda being here feels extremely unnecessary in my opinion. She doesn't really learn or do anything while spending time in the past, other than seeing that Ganondorf is evil I guess, but she notices that the moment she meets him. The only real thing we see her do is turn herself into a dragon to repair the Master Sword, which technically means there's 2 Master Swords during Breath of the Wild, but let's not get too deep into that. I was really disappointed in this game's plot. It takes a few notes from Ocarina of Time, but does them way worse, and the memory structure only holds back what could have been a more interesting plot. The new characters don't get any time to shine or development of any kind, and any interesting ideas are thrown to the wayside as soon as they're introduced. I think the most disappointing thing for me is Ganondorf himself. This is the first time the guy has been voiced in a game, so I was really hoping they give him more of a personality or motivation other than just, I'm evil. I think the game would have been a lot more interesting if both Link and Zelda had been sent back in time together. This would allow you to spend more time with each of the characters and develop them more, while also giving an excuse for the map to be noticeably different. Plus getting to see Link and Zelda interact more would have been a nice bonus. While I was initially excited about the game's narrative, getting all of the memories did nothing but deflate any kind of momentum the game had going for me, and it only became worse as I became more and more disillusioned with the overworld exploration. One of my favorite things in Breath of the Wild was getting lost in its vast overworld. It felt like there was always something new and exciting hiding around every corner, whether that was a new shrine, a Korok puzzle, an enemy encampment. There was so much to see and do that at times it was almost overwhelming. So I was really disappointed when my favorite aspect of Breath of the Wild slowly became my least favorite aspect of Tears of the Kingdom. I mentioned earlier that this game uses the same map as the original game, and I think that's where a lot of the fatigue comes from for me. I was struck with this feeling of been there, done that, because I have been there, done that back in 2017. The newer stuff that was added to break up the monotony left a lot to be desired. I was really intrigued by the idea of the Sky Islands. Skyward Sword was one of my first Zelda games, so I was really excited to see them expand on the sky gimmick from that game, but instead I got pretty much the same thing all over again. The tutorial takes place on one of the Sky Islands, and it set a really big expectation for the rest of them. It's very reminiscent of the Great Plateau area from the first game, teaching you the ins and outs in this game on a pretty big landmass. Unfortunately, this is the biggest area on the Sky map. The rest of the Sky Islands feel very cookie cutter and have very little to actually do on them outside of a handful of shrines and puzzles every now and then. Now credit where credit is due, I think it's fun figuring out how to get from island to island since a lot of them are pretty far apart, and being able to dive from the sky to the overworld without a loading screen is pretty impressive. But with how much they were pushing the sky stuff in the marketing, I thought it was going to be more substantial than just a few landmasses scattered around the map. In fact, I think I spent more time exploring the other sub-area this game adds. When I first stumbled upon the depths, I was pretty intrigued by them. I hadn't seen anything about this area before launch, so getting to learn more about it as I played through the game sounded pretty cool, but in execution, I think it's really lame. The depths are this game's equivalent of the Dark World concept from past Zelda games, only this time they made it literally because you can't see shit down here. The only way you can light up your surroundings are with these light plants you can throw on the ground, and with these light route checkpoints scattered around the map. Exploring this area quickly becomes monotonous. There's not a whole lot to actually do here, and you spend most of your time painstakingly throwing down light sources just to see 3 feet in front of you. Otherwise, you're stuck just looking at this for 3 years. Exploring is often tedious, if not outright frustrating, especially if you run into one of these walls that separate some areas. Since you can't see very far in front of you, it's often hard to tell if this is just a normal mountain or a large roadblock, so you end up wasting time trying to find a way around it only to see that you can't even manage that. The enemies here are covered in a material called gloom, which depletes your maximum health when they attack you, which makes them pretty annoying to deal with. Eventually I stopped fighting enemies down here altogether unless I absolutely had to, because it just wasn't worth the hassle. There are some cool mining areas and Yiga clan outposts scattered around the place, and it does house some pretty strong weapons, but it's not enough to make exploring the whole thing worth it in my opinion. I think it would have been better if this area was comprised of smaller chunks rather than a full-size map under the overworld. Then it would feel like less of a slog while stumbling your way through the dark, and you would still keep the cooler areas that make the depths somewhat worth exploring. Playing Tears of the Kingdom was a very conflicting experience for me. There's so much in this game that I adore, like the Ultra Hand and the building mechanics. The dungeons are way more unique than in Breath of the Wild, and I think the cave systems are a really cool addition to the open world. To me, the shrines feel a lot more substantial than in Breath of the Wild. The focus on physics-based puzzle design adds a lot more creativity and nuance to the puzzle solving. I also like that there's more ways to find stuff without a guide. You still have the shrine detector like in the first game, but the light routes you find in the depths are connected to shrines in the overworld, and vice versa, so it becomes easier to find both as you progress through the game. There's also a bunch of old maps you can find that point to chests that have costumes previously tied to amiibos, which I think is a great addition. In a vacuum, Tears of the Kingdom feels a lot closer to what I envisioned Breath of the Wild would be like back when it was first announced, which I think in a way is part of the problem since I've already played Breath of the Wild to death. The more I go back to play these games, the more stale they feel to me. I don't even know if that's the right word to describe this feeling, but whenever I play these games, I feel like I go into autopilot. There's only so many times I can explore the same looking areas for the same types of materials, or fighting the same types of enemies over and over again, for things that ultimately don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. These games feel extremely exhausting. I put like 70 hours into this thing after putting 80 hours into Breath of the Wild, and I only ended up completing half of the main quest. After a while, it feels like I'm doing things just to mark them off a checklist, rather than doing them because I find them engaging. It's not a feeling I get with other super long games I've played, like the Persona and Xenoblade series. Games that I love and can more easily replay without this feeling of fatigue. I think I could be a lot softer on these two games if we were still getting smaller, traditional Zelda games every now and then. I miss the shorter, more focused games in the series, like Majora's Mask or A Link Between Worlds, games I can go back to every few years and still have a solid time with, without dropping a minimum of 40 hours just to get the baseline experience. I don't know if I'm willing to wait 6 or 7 years between every release, just to get a similar experience to the game I already put a substantial amount of time into. In a lot of ways, Tears of the Kingdom feels more like a Breath of the Wild 1.5 rather than a full-on sequel. While there are a lot of interesting new mechanics that change the way you interact with the overworld, at the end of the day you end up doing the same things you were already doing in Breath of the Wild. It could be a byproduct of them deciding to reuse the same map in an attempt to save time, but I think the open world structure as it is now makes it hard for these games to live up to their full potential. Since the game is structured in such a way that you can do pretty much anything at any given time, there's only so much they can do to up the difficulty as the game progresses. So instead of building on mechanics and giving you more tools to work with as time goes on, you end up using the same tools in the same way over and over again, or fight enemies that are the same as the enemies you fought at the beginning of the game, only this time they're a different color and do more damage. I think this structure does work pretty well if you look at just one game or the other, but playing both introduces a lot of fatigue to the experience. Maybe I'm just not a big fan of open world games, but I find that I much prefer the linear progression of past games, since it allows them to build on their mechanics in a more meaningful way. That's not to say that these games are lacking in solid mechanics, but there's only so many times I can build the same plane or hot air balloon, or stick a few things together and still have it be engaging, especially after doing it for over 70 hours. At the end of the day, I don't hate Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, but I don't particularly love them either. I can't really see myself coming back to these games anytime soon, which sucks coming from a series that has a bunch of games I love replaying over and over again. I think I'd be okay if these games stayed as one-off experiences, rather than being the groundwork for the rest of the series going forward.